So the first thing, and if there's one thing I do want you to take away from this talk in general, is that if anybody thinks that there's a divide between religion and science, they don't understand religion or they don't understand science. And that's just the bottom line. And most problems that arise when either becomes contradictory to the other is when either there's bad faith or there's bad science. And unfortunately, both of those are quite rampant. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to be saying a lot of words in Greek to you Grecophones out there. I will be butchering all of those words. So what is science? Right? Science is a word that everybody uses, but it's one of those words that everybody uses, but nobody really knows what it means. So there's lots of different interpretations of what science is, but the most literal meaning of science is knowledge. It comes from the Latin word scientia, which from Merriam-Webster Dictionary means knowledge, science, especially knowledge based on demonstrable and reproducible data. So basically, you could categorize anything as science if you know it and it's reproducible. So the classic example is the sun comes up every day, right? The sun comes up every day. We know that the sun comes up every day. That's a datum. That's a piece of it's a datum, one piece of data. We know that the sun is going to come up every day. Now, if you integrate all of these big pieces of information together, you start to build scientific theories. But scientific theories aren't as strong as the data which you observe. So let's say that, so theories are kind of a story that brings together all of these things that you see in the outside world. So the sun rises and it comes up. I hypothesize that there is a man in a chariot dragging it across the sky, and that's how it goes from one side to the other, and then there's another person with another chariot dragging it across on the sky. Now, how do we test this theory, right? That means we should go look for a guy with a chariot. If we don't find the guy with a chariot, or if we find some other force or some other agent that's acting, that's what we should ascribe to. That's our new theory. So theories are always changing, but the data should not change. Usually when data change, it means that either somebody faked the data, which happens more than you would like to think, or our tools aren't precise enough. So technology and science, although we think that technology or that science feeds into technology, we can understand parts of the atom and then we can make these supercomputers. The interplay between technology and science is a little bit more confusing than it would at first seem, because engineering is an older discipline than science in some respects. They built the pyramids without having any understanding of what gravity was. All of these wonders of the ancient world, marvels of engineering, they did it with rudimentary or arithmetical knowledge. So in Greek, the word for science is episteme. Now in Greek, as there usually is, there are three words for knowledge, roughly. There's gnosis, episteme, and doxa. Now I'm not going to talk too much about doxa because that word, kind of the meaning changed when the Septuagint was created, because in the ancient period, doxa was a kind of common knowledge, right? It was common belief, things that you would hear in the marketplace. Things that people were saying that weren't necessarily true. Whereas episteme was always kind of this reliable, repeatable, testable kind of knowledge. And you can see this type of episteme all the way back to the beginnings of Western civilization and science in general, with different philosophers and the way that they interpreted the world. And another thing to note is that science and philosophy, so for example, Isaac Newton's book where he came up with Newtonian physics, it's called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. So philosophy and science kind of have been mixed together, and it's only in the past couple hundred years that we've seen them separated. So and there's a reason why the highest degree that you can get most of the time, PsyDs aside, is a PhD, and it's a doctorate in philosophy. So there's a certain degree of wisdom that goes with doing science, and that's a historical thing that's been the case for a long time. So the thing about episteme that's different from gnosis, but I'll talk more about gnosis later. Episteme is all about a type of bounded knowledge. Episteme is I see the sun and the sun rises. I expect the sun to rise. I can observe certain features of the pool table with the way that the billiard balls move, those kinds of things. And the way that this is done conventionally in the physical sciences, I don't want to talk too much about the social sciences because they rely on a little bit different methodology and there's less of a consensus as to how it's done. Physical sciences, depending on how big or small you're getting, you're working with certain standards. So in physics, at least on a macro scale, that's the meter, the kilogram, and the second. So a meter is some fraction of the distance that light travels in 1 second. A kilogram is this piece of iridium metal that's kept under nitrogen somewhere in France, and they're really worried about it because it's like rusting slightly. So the model kilogram is like 1/1,000,000th off now, and there are people who are really, really worried about that. And then the second, something to do with the decay of a uranium atom, I think, or carbon-12. And sometimes, so in the context of more clinical science, medicine, those kinds of things, you have controls, or you have, if you can't directly put some kind of thing that you can measure, no kind of concrete meter stick, you have a control. So that's why when you have scientific trials for medicines, you have a control group, which is the placebo group, and then you have the trial group, and you compare the differences between those two groups, and you determine the magnitude of the effect based on the differences that you see between the two. So there's two ways that people come to scientific conclusions broadly. You can come to scientific conclusions logically through a process called deduction, and you can also come to scientific discovery through statistics. And the majority of the time when people, a decent amount of the time when people are talking about science, or they're trying to provide a counterexample, they're going to try to argue logically by providing a single counterexample that should make everything in that system change, while the other person is saying, well, most of the time it behaves this way. So if you see things, this is generally where people start talking about bell curves. So at a 95% confidence interval, which means 95% of the time, this is the behavior that we're going to expect, right? And those tails at the end in the natural sciences are not worried about too much because they're usually chalked up to different probability distributions and those kinds of things. In biology, it gets a little bit tricky because you expect certain things to be the case with most systems, but there's always people that don't respond to the medication, people who have slightly different physiology. And that is just the nature of the bell curve. So just because all people don't metabolize sugars the same way doesn't mean that all of our knowledge about sugar metabolism is wrong. It just means that there are certain cases in which we should be looking at things just with a little bit closer eye. The exceptions do not make the norm in science, and that is a really important thing to keep in mind, especially particularly pressing issues, vaccines. Some people respond very adversely to vaccines. This is a fact. But the majority of people respond very positively to vaccines. So that's why we need to make sure we're vaccinating people to make sure that we don't get outbreaks of measles and all that stuff. So the scientific revolution, as it were, was basically when they realized that they couldn't just rely on reinterpreting Aristotle to figure out how the world worked. It was less of a scientific revolution and more of kind of like a controlled fizzle burn, because it was over the course of like 300 years, and eventually people, were all the way kind of laughing at themselves from 200 years ago. So the reason why that came to be is because we had new data, we had new ways of measuring the world, we had new ways of synthesizing information, we had new mathematics that allowed us to manipulate the world. So Isaac Newton had a very special method of induction where basically he was an excellent geometer. He had a special way of translating his measurements in the laboratory into mathematics, and they were accurate enough so that they were accepted. Now, a slightly uncomfortable fact about science is that science does come the way of consensus. So what happens usually is if enough people say something is right, if enough scientists kind of agree that something is right, then it becomes, scientific canon, so to speak, which makes science difficult. It's a conservative field. It moves very slowly. But it moves in that way because if we just accepted theories off the bat wholesale, then we'd be making all kinds of mistakes. So the best theories are the ones that come from data. You observe the world, see how the states of the world are, and then you interpret them in ways that are generalizable within very, very narrow confines. If you have a scientific theory that can explain almost everything, it's very difficult to falsify. And that's why scientific theories that explain everything are very elusive or they're very bad. This is what a lot of cutting edge physics, Stephen Hawking tried to do a lot of this stuff. It falls apart very easily because when you explain too much, it begins to explain nothing at all. So when you take this data first method of doing science, you eliminate a lot of the problems that might come through overgeneralization. So if you, instead of looking at the world through, I expect the world to operate this way all the time, you put blinders on yourself. So if you were looking for exceptions, if you just test things, see what happens, and then repeat them without kind of coming up with some kind of story, that's a really good way to do science. And that's a very ancient way of doing science. That's the original Pyrrhonian skepticism, developed by a really cool guy named Sextus Empiricus, who was a physician, who was a philosopher, and he, instead of coming up with these theories about humors and stuff, he would have interventions. He would give someone something, see if it worked. If it didn't work, try another thing, and then he would just keep trying things. So the best science is kind of this tinkering science. It's okay to make mistakes. That's why, I think Father Alexi, we were talking about this, failing is a really good thing to do. Failing is a good thing to do in science. It's not necessarily going to sell, but it's important that you check all the time because you need to be making sure that people are being honest. Because there have been lots of controversies in science over the ages of people not being honest with their data. Probably one of the more interesting examples was Gregor Mendel, the one who came up with the way we do kind of modern genetics. His data was too good, so there was about 15 years ago, some skepticism arose whether he had just completely fibbed his data. And the consensus is kind of out on whether or not he fibbed his data, but it's important to kind of expect things to go a little bit wrong because we live in an open-ended world. We live in a world that we're not ever going to be able to describe totally scientifically. So there's a popular cultural narrative that has come up that science and religion are opposed somehow. And there's a multitude of ways that you can kind of spin this, but I think that to me, the one that's most salient is the fact that the Eastern and Roman empires had different parts of the Aristotelian corpus. So basically what that means is when Galileo and the Catholic Church kind of had their feud and their fallout, they didn't have Aristotle's kind of whole story about how he thought the world works. They had ratified everything that Aristotle had said through Thomas Aquinas, and if you disregarded that, it was like disregarding the Catholic Church. Now the reason for that is because when the New Testament was translated from Greek into Latin, these two words, episteme and gnosis, were turned into one word in Latin, which is scientia. So these two types of knowledge, which were distinct in the Greek corpus and throughout all of the ancient world, turned into one type of knowledge. And that led to a lot of confusion. So the Greek word gnosis is used in the New Testament 28 times, which is pretty high up there in terms of esoteric word usage. And it's used, I've got a footnote down there about the places where it shows up a lot. But episteme, the word about bounded knowledge, about, if Christ were to talk about how old the earth was, he didn't use that word once. So that just shows the fact that the importance of faith is not knowing how old the earth is. The importance of faith is not knowing exactly what kinds of genetic things led to where we are as human beings in the 21st century as highly evolved apes. It's about a higher reality. So an example of this kind of gnosis, and the word can be kind of confusing because we have the Gnostic heresies and that kind of thing. Gnosis is when you know something in your heart, right? So the word for gnosis is the same word for nous, same root word as nous, which in the Orthodox anatomy of the soul is the eye of the soul, which is the highest part of the soul, which is the part of the soul that can see God. And this is all kind of codified in the works of St. Gregory Palamas. So St. Isaac the Syrian says that when we have this kind of Gnostic, this knowledge, this gnosis, we can't speak about it. So that's why we often describe God in kinds of these negative senses. We can say some things about Christ, we can perceive God, we can perceive Christ, because he's the intermediary between that which is in the flesh and that which is truly transcendent. So because he has these two natures bound up, that is why we can understand both that which is bounded in the world, and we can try to perceive that which is unbounded. And through various spiritual practices and through faith, and that's why when a monk or someone who is very far advanced in their spiritual life says that they believe in the Trinity, it's this very visceral feeling that transcends the words on the page. So when we say I believe in one God the Father Almighty, right, you can say I believe. You can think of it in a very kind of rationalistic, watered down scientific way, or you can realize the levels of the mysteries that go into saying, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. Just all of those things in that sentence, you can boil them down to, there's things that are invisible, there's things that are visible, we see the things that are visible, we don't see the things that are invisible, and there's one God. But our faith faith shouldn't be just about kinds of these statements, like these truisms about the world that we kind of just accept wholesale. They're living things that we're supposed to learn more about every day and kind of perceive them more deeply as we go on. And this is different from the way that I can say that, this pool cue is 4 feet tall. If I say this pool cue is 4 feet tall, the pool cue is 4 feet tall. It might be 4 feet and 1 inch, but pretty much I can know everything about the height of the pool cue pretty quickly. I can write it down, and it can be transmitted very easily between two people. But if I say, God, the Trinity is God, there's a lot there. There's a lot more there, and there's a lot more that has to be thought about and digested and perceived and experienced. So gnosis is always about an experience, this experiential knowledge of the first person of God and of these transcendent mysteries, and they're very real. So that's why, when, for example, during the Transfiguration, the apostles, they fell on their faces because what they were seeing, they couldn't handle it in their bodies because it was so far above them, that absolute truth of Christ. And so even in their bounded bodies, they weren't able to fully appreciate all of that. So, like I said before, the Scientia, when it was translated in the Vulgate by St. Jerome, it just it eclipsed these two words, episteme and gnosis, and so we were no longer able to meaningfully discern, at least in the Christian West, they were not able to discern between these two types of knowledge as frequently. And if you read any of the Church Fathers, any of the Greek Fathers, they always talk about spiritual knowledge in terms of gnosis. St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Gregory Palamas, it's consistent across all of the Fathers, because they weren't concerned with how wide is God. He's wider than the earth, which is, how many miles. These are not questions of concern for our salvation. They're interesting questions. They can be questions that we can use to alleviate the sufferings of others, but they're not questions that are necessary for our salvation. So when this word scientia that's used in the Latin translation of the Gospels is the same word that we use for science now. And because of scientia being used in the Gospels, it assumes a certain degree of circumscribability to our knowledge of God. So this brings us back to the Aristotle problem. So what happened is that when the Byzantine Empire split, the Roman Empire split, kind of the eastern half and the western half. The western half of the empire was cut off from the eastern half of the empire because of the various Muslim invasions and the Ottomans and all those kinds of things in the course of history. There was a disconnect. So they had all of the Aristotelian corpus in the Byzantine education system, whereas they only had bits and pieces of it in the West. Now, this is really important because the books that they had in the West were what we call Aristotle's organon. So these are the books basically where Aristotle says, this is how you do logic, right? And so it proceeds on very rational, it relies a lot on reason, and they were missing a very important book, and that very important book is called Aristotle's Metaphysics. And Aristotle's Metaphysics is a really, really long, really confusing book about being. It's being. It's about being. And they didn't have it in the West. So in Aristotle's Metaphysics, he goes, yeah, I'm not entirely sure about all that stuff. I could have been wrong, so just don't worry too much about it. Like, just be a good guy. And they didn't have that in the West, so they kind of codified and proceeded along these lines with the Aristotelian corpus, and that gave birth to scholasticism. And you had this very rigorous type of medieval logic that was taught in the systems of Europe. But in the Byzantine Empire, they didn't have this thing. They always had this sophisticated understanding that the two were different, and so there was no real effort within the Christian East to kind of discern between scientific knowledge and spiritual knowledge. So that's why there was first I want to say, I was talking earlier about Christ is, or the spiritual truths of God is ineffable, inconceivable, ever existing, eternally the same. If you said that word to a physicist, if you said the truest thing is a thing you can't really know about completely, they'd say, what do you mean? We have the atom. We can decide all these things. So these are kinds of difficult to digest truths, and they're truths that you have to prepare yourself for. So there's a bunch of French guys in like the 1960s decided that the difference between like modern philosophy or modern thinking and ancient thinking was that the ancient thinkers, their universities were like monasteries. So Epicurus kind of gets a bad rap because people thought he was all about pleasure, and they thought he had all kinds of bacchanalia going on. That's really not what they did. In Plato's Academy, they pretty much lived like monks. They fasted, they did all these regiments, and it was to purify themselves, in a sense, to be able to receive and understand these kinds of higher order truths. So, coming up in Lent, we have, is it the fourth Sunday that's St. Gregory Palamas, or the fifth?
Fourth, right?
Fourth. Okay. So, on the fourth Sunday of Lent,
It's one of those.
it's one of them. So in the fourth Sunday of Lent, we commemorate St. Gregory Palamas, who was
That's the third.
it's a third?
It's the 15th of March.
Again, it's not science, Zach, remember.
Depends which calendar
It's-
you're
it's-
looking
it's
at.
around-
Well, it's the same calendar.
And remember, it's St. Gregory Palamas, not St. Gregory of Palamas.
Did I say St. Gregory
No.
Palamas? Okay.
I'm making a blanket statement so
Okay.
everybody knows.
Okay, so St. Gregory Palamas is a very, very important figure in church history because there was a big dispute in the 15th century called the was it the 14th? I believe 14th century, I'm sorry. The big dispute in the 14th century called the Hesychastic Controversy. Now, the Hesychastic Controversy, I think, is a really good way to sum up the divide between religion and science, as is presented to us in the secular West right now. So the Hesychastic Controversy was, there was this monk, cleric named Barlaam, who came to the Byzantine Empire and said, what is this contemplative prayer stuff? What are these energies and these lights that you're talking about? You're worshiping demons. And all of the monks on Mount Athos said, well, this is just what we do. We've just been reading the books from the ancient church fathers, and we fast and we pray all day, and if God is nice, we'll see the light. We'll experience his energies. So this led to, it was part of the what led to the Byzantine Civil War, actually. It split the empire. And so what Gregory Palamas did was he defended the Orthodox practice of hesychism, which is stillness. So monastic contemplative prayer. And he did this by saying that, look, God works, there's the essence of God, and then there's the energies of God. Now, this kind of relates back to what St. Athanasius says, that God became man that man might become God. So through purification of our souls and prayer and these kinds of other spiritual practices, we're able to participate in the energies of God. We're able to perceive him directly through the uncreated light that the apostles saw on Mount Tabor, and that this is the truest and highest expression of a Christian life. So what this means is that we can perceive God through our senses, quite directly. Now, Barlaam was from the West. He was trained in scholasticism, which is a type of religious philosophy based on Aristotelian logic. And he said, no. You access God through intellectual exercises. You know, we have certain doctrines, and we have postulates, and we proceed deductively, and that way we find out the truth about God. And it was incompatible with this Orthodox monastic practice of being able to discern and participate with God in his energies. So, obviously, Palamas won, so to speak, and Barlaam got kicked back to the west. So, and the Byzantine Empire stood for not too much longer, but long enough. So, this leads us to the fact that Orthodoxy, I believe, is uniquely suited to answer scientific questions, because we have this twofold way of dealing with truth that allows us to investigate about the physical world without worrying about stepping on the toes of the church. Roughly, I mean, certainly you can do science that's bad for your soul, but you can do science, you can measure things, you can postulate, and as long as you're doing good science, you're likely to not get in trouble with the church. Now, this is an interesting point to bring up, because there's a lot of bad science that's going on right now. And people, when you use the word science or use the word logic, when you're discussing something with someone, something happens, and all of a sudden everything you say becomes infallible. Oh, because science says so. And that's where we get kind of you get bad arguments about evolution, which I think are some of the most egregious, and you get bad arguments about free will, and arguments about evolution. So if you look at the way that people who talk about evolution argue, their reasoning proceeds thus. They say, species change over time, therefore humans evolved from a single carbon soup. Has anybody seen the carbon soup turn into anything in a cell? Nope, we haven't seen that. The closest we got is a bunch of experiments in the 1960s at the University of Chicago, where they put some methane and ran electric currents through, and then they scraped the inside of this glass container, and then they said, oh, there's amino acids. That means that life can spontaneously be created in the primordial Earth atmosphere. But there's problems with that, because if you look at the mathematics and the probability of that, the chance of a single ribosome, which is the part of a cell that creates proteins, the thermodynamic probability of a ribosome, a single small element, a single small part of a human cell, of all cells, assembling through random thermodynamic events, is 1 in 1 times 10 to the 64,000, right? This is an unfathomably large number. Just to give you some context on how big this number is, there have been 1 times 10 to the 120th discrete quantum events since the beginning of time. The numbers are preposterous. So the current model of evolution by neo-Darwinism, by random selection, as they call it, the math is not there. And because the math is not there, it's not good science. It's they're operating on an ideology, and this ideology, they're trying to undermine faith, right? They're starting with the premise of, we know that there's no God, therefore we're going to try to prove that there is no God through these means, and they proceed that way. And you need to, they're very tricky sometimes with the way that people argue. And now there's another argument that I like.
It's faith. It is faith.
It is faith.
It is a religion.
Yeah.
And they operate on the level of presuppositional apologetics. You have to presuppose something to get the result.
Exactly. And another perfect example of that is a lot of people who advocate for kind of this rational secular society. They say, okay, well, people are largely moral, right? So if we just get rid of religion, morality will stay largely the same. The problem with that is that if you take the morality of 21st, broadly speaking, the morality of the West, it's completely because of reforms right after the Edict of Milan. Roman divorce law and domestic abuse law before the Edict of Milan were horrible. You could a husband could just get rid of his wife if he didn't like her. You could throw your babies off the cliff. Horrible, horrible things. And it's the kind of stable morality that we have now in the West is purely a product of the Church Fathers. And most people don't realize that. So as we kind of drift away from these kinds of moral, transcendent values, you can see how we're kind of reverting to the morality from the pagan lands. Abortion is no different than throwing your baby off the cliff that you didn't like. The Spartans looked at the babies. This one won't make a good warrior, throw it off the cliff. It's just the primitive form of abortion. So as we see kind of the faith being eroded from under us, we're going to start seeing more and more of these things that were changed because of the early Church Fathers. So another thing is these so-called the neo-atheists. So Richard Dawkins, Samuel Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Hawking. Each of them present a slightly different version of the same story, which is basically a recycling of a 2,000-year-old argument by Epicurus, who basically came up with this logic puzzle about, if God is all-powerful, then why doesn't he destroy evil? Therefore, he's not all-powerful. And it's kind of, this strictly, it seems, to someone who wants to not believe in God, you could argue that it's a very logical way of arguing it. But then again, in the Christian East, we said these rules of predicate logic, they never applied to God. So you can't apply this logic to God. And so it's a problem of the same kind as if an all-powerful God could an all-powerful God make a rock so big that even he was incapable of lifting it, right? So atheists along the ages have tried to kind of play with these problems of the all-powerful God, like is an all-powerful thing possible? But we can't understand the all-powerful thing, and attempts to circumscribe and understand the all-powerful thing are just going to fall apart.
The other problem with the new atheists, I'm sorry, but the other problem with the new atheists, especially with guys like Hitchens and Dawkins, is that they exist on borrowed capital. They have to borrow from the Judeo-Christian worldview to make their arguments.
Yes.
So Dawkins, argued over and over and over again that Christianity was itself immoral, and he used Christian principles, Judeo-Christian principles, to argue that the Judeo-Christian ethic was immoral. Whereas if you're going to be consistent, if you're going to be a secularist, if you're going to be a scientistic naturalist, then you have to argue and be consistent from that worldview.
Right.
So if he wants to argue that God is immoral for allowing Joshua and the Israelites to perpetuate genocide in Canaan, the naturalist has no argument. They have to say that a passionless universe simply doesn't care what happens to Canaanites.
Right.
And so there's nothing wrong with Joshua slaughtering thousands of Canaanites.
Exactly.
The morality has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And they exist on borrowed capital to make their moral outrage, basically.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and you can. I think they're waning in popularity a lot. Some of them are just very slick rhetoricians.
Lear went out of the tires when Dawkins died, I think.
Yeah. Well, Dawkins is still alive.
Or I'm sorry,
Hitchens.
Hitchens. Sorry, Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens.
Hitchens.
Yeah. So yeah, most of these arguments that are being utilized by the so-called neo-atheists, they're not new. They're trying to create. They're recycling old problems. There are always going to be people who want to undermine the faith. These are just facts of the fallen world. So, not only are orthodoxy and science philosophically compatible, the evidence is there. We have Metropolitan Nicholas. He's a metropolitan in Greece. He's a PhD in astrophysics from MIT, and you can look up interviews with him on Greek TV. He's talking about exploring the universe and the Big Bang and these kinds of things. Now, the Big Bang, that's another thing. The term the Big Bang was created by a Catholic priest. So all of these accounts of the universe coming something into nothing, science has never seen something come into nothing. So you're already presupposing a kind of faith. No matter, you have to start somewhere if you're going to try to make a picture about how the whole world works. And St. Luke of Crimea was a personal favorite saint of mine. He was one of the people don't, I think, appreciate exactly how good of a surgeon he was. He was truly one of the best surgeons of the 20th century. Yeah.
I was going to say, can you go back for a second? Because I think it would be helpful for a lot of us to have a less of an understanding of how the Big Bang kind of links up with Orthodox theology, especially the creation story.
Okay.
There's a lot of science there that just the way that theorists have said the Big Bang happens is actually very Orthodox, very Christian. And so we hear the word Big Bang and I think in the world we think, oh, Big Bang, that's what's taught in school. The truth is it's not all that different. We don't say that something came out of nothing from nowhere. We say that God was there, his hand was in it.
Yeah, so the Big Bang, in strictly scientific terms, the way that they talk about the Big Bang is that there was an explosion of matter into antimatter. So it's actually a good spring point. The name of this talk is Spiritual Supersymmetry. So the reason why I chose that name is because in physics there's this thing called supersymmetry, which is basically that for every one kind of very small particle, you have the same exact particle with the opposite spin, and this goes all the way up. So this balances out the cosmos, in a sense, and so our understanding of science can buttress our understanding of faith all the way back. But going back to the creation, the way that the world was made, first of all, we didn't observe how the things came into be. So from a strictly empirical standpoint, we really can't posit that in a strong sense. We can theorize about it. We can try to make arguments based on what matter looks like. But we can't really say strictly scientifically how the universe came into be. And so, I don't have the Genesis 1 at the tip of my tongue, but if you look at the way that the 7 days of creation 6 days of creation are split up, it kind of makes sense. The Big Bang, God created the heavens and the earth. God speaking can be this Big Bang. The naming of the fish and the creation of the water first and then the earth and kind of this transition.
Evolution is there from simple to more complex, from the inorganic to the organic.
Yeah, it's all continuous. Yes?
When you're talking about the creation of the earth, the nostos and I'm going to butcher this. Thank you.
Yeah.
The Latin. How do we assume we know what God's day is? Because I have a lot of people saying it occurred in one day. Well, but that's not maybe our day.
Exactly.
And that could be the nostos of what's God's day.
Right.
So they are not opposed to each other, they should complement each other.
Yeah, and you bring up a perfect point. So if we say that the days so what is a day, right? It's one time the earth spins around, right? The earth wasn't spinning until the third day, at least. So how are you measuring something when
But you don't know.
Just devil's advocate, though, I'll just throw it out here. The problem is that once the sun is created on the fourth day, the word that is used in Genesis doesn't change. The word yom remains the same.
Yeah.
So you can find arguments. You can make a convincing argument from a linguistic perspective for either way. And the other question is, could God have created everything in a 24-hour period? Could God have created everything in a millisecond? Yes. You know,
It doesn't matter.
But and that I think is the point, is that it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know, we're told in 1 Peter that for God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day.
What is the time?
For God.
The definition of the time.
There you go. There it is.
Okay, I mean,
how do we measure time?
so I mean, we can talk
The
about.
measurement for time
No.
before God.
No, what
Right.
is
So time is a created thing.
The history starts only after God created history.
But God lives outside of time.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
So
what I'm saying.
yeah.
Right. But we're talking about creation, in which time does exist.
So I wasn't going to get to this to the end, but I guess I'll touch on it a little bit. Time isn't real.
Yeah. It's relative.
Well, it's
It's continuous.
It's continuous.
it's not it's so
Since God created
since God so
It's created.
well so time what time is time is a series of different entropic states throughout the universe.
Exactly.
Right, so it's different states of randomness. So the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy is always increasing, which means that basically everything's always getting more random. Right, so things are constantly getting more disorderly, and that's what time is. So, and there's a fixed amount of. That's why I was going to talk about this at the end. The universe. So the way that they talk about in physics, the end of time. They call it the heat death of the universe, where there's going to be no more matter left. Everything is going to be down to smallest constituent particles, and it's going to be really hot. So time is just different states of randomness throughout the universe, and that's why if you travel at the speed of light, you don't experience time, because the fastest speed that any particle can move is at the speed of light. And if you're traveling at the speed of light, you can be experiencing no entropy, therefore you're experiencing no time, and you don't age. Now this gets even more problematic because time is what we call an emergent property. So on a quantum level, there is no entropy, so that means there is no time. So that's why quantum mechanics is very much unintuitive, and you have difficulties with, we have the uncertainty principle.
probabilistic.
Yeah, it's probability distributions. We don't know the position.
The
or
other way you talked about the knowledge through statistics.
Yeah, the statistical mechanics. It's
It's
prime
not,
Different
example.
type of knowledge.
it's not space and time.
No, it's not.
They are interchangeable.
Yeah. So that's why when I say time
Space
doesn't.
and time, they are interchangeable.
So hypothetically, you could do time travel. If you could figure out a way to change the entropic state of every molecule in the universe, and you could kind of wind it back, that's how you could do time travel. But that
Probably Paul did a lot of time traveling. when
Yeah,
he,
yeah, certainly. I mean-
went to the third sky or.
yeah. So you can see this in a lot of Orthodox saints who have gifts of bilocation. You know, they've transcended kinds of the spiritual and fallen entropic states of their bodies, and they're able to be at two places in the same time, because they've reached that level of theosis, they've reached that level of purity, that they're able to transcend the fallen human nature and be in two places at the same time. So St. Luke of Crimea, I think he was very involved. He gave a sermon in the 1950s about kind of the state of evolutionary science, why it's not really science. You know, I think he says no one has ever seen an ape turn into a man. You know, we haven't observed this thing, so therefore it's not really responsible for us to say that these kinds of things are scientific. And Orthodox are the most highly educated Christian group in the United States. We have the highest amount of people with college degrees, highest number of people with PhDs of any Christian group.
That's based on statistics?
Yeah, Pew Research Center. Pew Research Center. They produce statistics, I believe, every 2 years. You can look it up online. Now another thing that's
They don't live in Eastern Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's science.
I'm kidding.
another really interesting thing is that the Greeks weren't the ancient Greeks weren't terribly concerned with the physical world. You know, Plato's cave is all about getting out of the physical world and being in the pure world of forms. Now, in order to do science, you need to have like stuff. You need to have stuff that matters in order for you to worry about it. Now, when we talk about Christ as the Logos in the beginning of the Gospel of John, this word logos is an unbelievably important and historical term in Greek thought. And this word logos, it's used in slightly different ways throughout different ancient Greek thinkers, but pretty much the uniting substance that they all have is that logos is basically what makes stuff work. It's what makes our relationship to the outside world. It's the different, we're no longer just locked in our heads. We can communicate with what's on the outside. Logos is the ability for things to have intermediary relationships with one another, and that's why Christ is the Logos. He is the intermediary between that which is truly transcendent, between God and man, because he is the God-man. He is both truly God and truly man. So he is the human personification of this, what used to be an abstract, purely philosophical concept.
So is man for matter? It's the transition from matter to Jesus Christ to God.
Yes.
So it's a series of
Evolution.
intermediates.
Well, not so much because God was both fully God and fully man. Because if you say that it's just a transition from matter into spiritual, then you can.
But men are made of matter and spirit.
And spirit, right? But
Just
if
like
you,
God, like Jesus Christ was both
Yeah, but we're
human and God.
right.
But we're not God.
So this is kind of the best place to kind of learn about the early thoughts on the logos is in Justin Martyr, who had this concept of the spermatikos logos, which is the seeds of the word that are spread throughout the cosmos. So that means that you can learn about the physical world. This is how people who might not have been exposed to the light of Christ through the Gospels are still able to participate and kind of see God wherever they are. And sometimes this is accomplished through science. So this brings us to something that I just recently thought of, and by no means is it Orthodox doctrine, or it's just a little curiosity. So the three wise men from the East were people who studied the stars. So astronomy, well, back then astronomy and astrology were kind of conflated, but astronomy was considered to be kind of the premier science. It was the premier way to kind of measure the earth with respect to the stars, and you were able to make inferences about what was going on in the physical world. Now, the three wise men, they saw the star. They observed what was in the beyond, and it brought them to Christ. But they were a little late. So by observing the physical world, we're able to kind of access Christ in everything. We're able to access that which is divine in the everyday, because Christ is in all things and everywhere. And you can see this too, not just in the high science of the three wise men, but you also see it in the shepherds. The shepherds were tending their sheep, these kinds of practical, day-to-day things. That's a type of knowledge too, and that brought the shepherds to worship Christ. There's a quote by Werner Heisenberg, who's the father of quantum mechanics. It's up in the air whether it's apocryphal or not. I'm pretty sure it's in one of his letters. But it says, the first gulp from the glass of the natural sciences will make you an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. So this is the founder of quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics has experimentally pretty much never been proven wrong. There's something to be said there. There's certain, once you get to the end of describing the physical world, you're kind of just, well, what's next? And God is where that is. I kind of say jokingly sometimes that quantum mechanics didn't exist 500 years ago. Things just kind of proceeded through Newtonian physics, and God made the world that way. To push the thing, it has inertia. But then mankind got a little more clever, so God had to come up with these extra things to kind of just make sure that we didn't run out of things to explore.
Don't get bored, huh?
Yeah, so we don't get bored. We have more things to look into. And now, in order to confirm, string theory, we're going to need a particle collider the size of the solar system. So maybe God isn't going to have to come up with more stuff.
Is it true that God tries maybe to hide through more and more sophisticated means His presence?
Yeah, because God, if you can't love something that you have to believe in. You have to have faith, and that's where that
Exactly.
that's where that love comes from.
It's a mystery.
Yeah. And science it will never end. There were some people that tell you that science is going to end. I am fairly confident in the fact that we're never going to have all the answers. It's impossible for us to have all the answers. Pretty sure that was mathematically demonstrated by this guy named Henry Poincaré in the early 20th century. It was
Also, Gödel has a theory about.
Gödel's incompleteness theorem. There you go. Didn't even think of that. So, but like I said earlier, science can be used for bad things. That, it can be applied in ways that are evil. Herod wanted to know the location of Christ, but he couldn't, so he slaughtered 14,000 innocents. Knowledge is a powerful thing. Like Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power. So you can use this knowledge for good. You can use it to bring people to Christ. You can use it to alleviate the sufferings of others, to try to improve the well-being of your fellow man, to understand the cosmos, or you can use it for evil things, because it's a very, very powerful tool. And even in the scriptures, we're kind of called to a kind of science, of experimentation. The Apostle Paul says, "But test them all, hold on to what is good." Try things out. If it works, it's true. This is a kind of science. It's a kind of practice in order to discover what is right. Doubting Thomas. Thomas didn't believe that Christ was risen from the dead because it was just so beyond him. He had to experience it. He had to see it. He had to test it. Come and see. Don't just take my word for it. Go out in the world. See what's going on. Experiment. Try to understand that which is around you. So that's pretty much all the stuff that I wanted stuff that I'm really confident about. But now there's some fun things about the way that we talk about the universe in the scriptures that I think are worth noting. So I talked about this earlier, that time doesn't really exist. It's a series of entropic states. In general relativity, we have 3 dimensions, and then we're kind of proceeding in time based on these various entropic states. And so all of time is, in a sense, happening all at once. So because God doesn't experience entropy, he doesn't experience time, it's not so much that he's immortal, but he's atemporal. He doesn't have time. God has no kind of binding entropic nature. So he's able to move in between and act in this kind of way. And that's why we say Christ is risen. Christ is born, because all of these events are happening, in a sense, all at the same time. So the act of Christ being risen, it's an ongoing eschatological event that allows us to move on to that which is beyond. We didn't say Christ was risen. We celebrate Pascha on a certain date, but the mystery of Pascha transcends just our experience of it in time. So these are events that don't have entropy, in a sense. And I said earlier, in general relativity, one of the postulates is that you can't move faster than the speed of light. Right? So it says in the Psalms that those fixed their balance, they should not be passed. Right? Now, long ago, perhaps they thought, once you get to the end of the earth, here be dragons. Right? So you can't go any further. But now we know that there are certain physical bounds to that which can be done. Like, you can't travel faster than the speed of light. So, that was fixed their balance, they should not be passed. God created these laws of physics. God created the laws which the universe operates on. And they have this, it's called the Goldilocks theorem, that, if any one of the constants in the universe were slightly different, that everything wouldn't have come together in the way that it did. So God created the universe in such a way that everything just kind of works very nicely. And his knowledge of how to make things work nicely reaches far beyond our ability to understand that which is going on. So in quantum mechanics, I know I'm jumping all around here, I apologize, but in quantum mechanics, they don't really know what's going on, in a sense. There's different interpretations, because it's very non-intuitive. You can have things, a thing can be in 2 places at the same time in quantum mechanics, and there's several explanations about how this comes to be. But the one that's the most salient with Orthodoxy is called the Bohmian interpretation. So a hidden variable that somewhere in our understanding of quantum mechanics we're able to predict things, but that there's a pilot wave, there's another variable that we're not sure about, that we can't discover, that's kind of mediating what's going on all the time. So this could be, by all means, God's intervention in making sure that things aren't random. This is where God intervenes. It's where our ability to do the mathematics stops. He is able to intervene, and he kind of says, this is my domain. You're not going to be able to understand this physical aspect of the world, because this is where I'll be operating. And the last thing is the heat death of the universe. So when we talk about hell, the eternal fire, the punishment of people, how are we doing on time? Okay, finishing up. We always talk about the fire. The fire at the end of the world. Could this be the heat death of the universe when the world ends and things are engulfed? Is it going to be a literal kind of heat? Because hell, it's a sense of spiritual coldness. You're at a distance from God. But is this how the material world is going to end? It's going to end in this chaos of fire. Who knows? These are mysteries. So that's all I got. Thank you.
We've got a lot.